Maybe it'll surprise you, but it doesn't surprise me. It says this: have your expectations gone up, gone down, or stayed the same since doing your mock maths exam? And the answer, so this was the first 52. I'm sure there's more people have filled it in since then, but I did this earlier for the PowerPoint. You can see that a lot of people's, their expectations, their hopes for their maths grade has gone down. So their confidence has taken a hit since doing the exam. Some people have stayed the same, of course. More, there's a good shot of people, nearly 17, 18% of people haven't done their maths exam yet. Maybe they've done paper 1, but not paper 2. For that reason, we won't speak about any specifics of the pre-exam. I will have to put up my hand, and please don't send me any hate mail, but I am the author of one of the papers of the pre's. I will say, I don't think the pre's are always difficult for every subject for the Leaving Cert. The one that I set, and and some of the ones out there I feel were unfair in terms of the standard, is that of what it will be in the Leaving Cert exam, and that's what one would want to see. Not too difficult, but not too easy. Just exactly around the standard that will be there. Some exams set, some of the national exams, and some set by teachers themselves, can be extremely challenging for students, and I can tell you why that is. And maybe if I flick to the next part, which are some of the comments and questions that came back to the survey, that'll lead in to what I'm about to say. I have completed my maths mock paper 1 before the midterm. It went terribly. I'm hoping for a H2, but my performance in the exam really dampened my expectations and confidence. Is this normal? That's the key phrase I want to focus in on. Any advice? I'm afraid paper 2 will be as difficult, if not more difficult. And that was a common experience for a number of students this year, that they did find some of the exams to be very challenging. Now, as I said at the start, I'm a maths teacher and I'm an economics teacher. So I have 2 sets of students in my school this year going for the Leaving Cert. And the difference, they're really great students in both classes. But the difference in our preparation for the pre is vast. In economics, we've finished the course. We've done revision. We've revised some of our economics students. We've revised supply and demand elasticity. And we've revised some of the market structures. So we're in great shape for the pre. They have the choice of the full paper, and we've revised some topics. Compare that to maths. We're working hard every day, but what were we doing? The day before the pre-exam, we were still learning new stuff, and we haven't everything finished. So therefore, in the maths exam, it's more challenging because we haven't had the chance to revise, and we haven't the choice of the full paper. So the question, is this normal? Is it normal to find the maths pre to be difficult? The answer is yes. Students do find it to be difficult. You could say, well, why aren't the exams made easier? Well, in fairness, I do think that people would kind of think it is fair that the pre-exam reflects what the Leaving Cert would be like. Some exams, people could argue, are too difficult, and I would find it hard to argue against it. Now, let me go through a couple more things here. I will just, before I go into these, I know people have questions about particular topics, etc., what you should focus on, what not. I am certainly going to be going through those in a moment. My class is very behind, and I don't know if we will finish the course. I really need a high grade. What should I do with the changes? How do I know which questions to choose in such a short time? If we do all the questions, will the examiner take our best one? Well, I'm going to answer that last part first. Yes. We'll look at the exam paper now in a moment, how many questions there are, how many you have to do. But the answer is yes, the examiner will take your best 4 short questions, your best 2 long questions. I sympathize and empathize with anyone in that situation. We all know that loads of people have found themselves in difficult situations during COVID. Teachers are no different. Sometimes teachers weren't able to attend school and come back, etc., etc. And I know that's a difficult situation for students to be in, and I will be addressing that question exactly as we go through it. What is the best thing for you to do in this situation? Okay, what is your opinion on the best way or strategy to study maths from now until the Leaving Cert and achieve a top grade. Usually I do this through exam questions, and I find very difficult to do. And I end up looking at videos of them having explained to me. Okay. In a nutshell, I will give you the most simple strategy for maths in general. How do you get better at maths? You get better at maths by practicing the questions, doing out the questions. However, you'd say, well, that's simple. Sure, why don't we all do that? However, there is a difficulty. I have the same difficulty in my class. You will see in a moment I talk about how the topics are interlinked. The strands of maths overlap. So in 5th year and the start of 6th year, it's very hard for a teacher to give exam paper questions to students, because if it's on calculus, there could be a bit of trigonometry sneak in there. Or if it's an algebra question, there could be a bit of induction coming. So the topics all overlap. So therefore, it's only after the pre that you really start to practice exam paper questions over and over again. And through that practice, it comes together. And I'm going to explain more about that, but keep that part in mind. It comes together, and it does. Okay. How can I stay in touch so you'll be alerted when you're taking bookings for the Easter revision course and the 21-day challenge? Well, you guys now are part of the tuition center. You've signed up. You have your, you have your login details, etc., etc. You will get emails about it to let you know on those things. But if you want to be absolutely sure, if you follow the tuition center on Instagram and Facebook, you will get all those parts. Okay, I know these next questions are important to people, and this is what we'll spend a lot of our time at for this next half an hour. What are your tips for the most prevalent questions on the paper? How should we approach the papers with the new adjustments timing-wise? Is it worth trying to do extra questions in section A for safekeeping, hoping to get marked in the best questions, which you will? Or should we stick to the instructed amount of questions? What are the most important topics and chapters to focus on? Okay, which carry the most marks? I'm going to be going through exactly that now in a minute. And I'm going to be giving you advice on which ones I think, what is the best strategy in terms of the number of questions to do. The most likely questions, I'll be going through that. So each year, what I do is I have this spreadsheet, this rolling spreadsheet year to year, where I have I have written down what's come up and what's likely to come up, and through a process, then I come up with what I think is likely to come up in the particular exam. You're not going to get everything right, but it's worked out pretty well so far. In your opinion, with the changes to the exams, is it advisable to leave out topic our teachers has told us is too risky? Well, I know some of my guys are on here tonight, and they know what I'm going to be saying to that. I'm going to be saying this. I am going to teach my students all of the course. However, I expect and know that they will not all study each one with a view to doing them in the exam. They will become strategic as it gets closer, and they will decide, okay, I'm not going to focus on this part. I am going to focus on the other part. So I'm going to teach them everything. I think that gives them the best shot. But I would expect them to be strategic. What topics should you focus on if you're aiming for a H4? Well, I know for a lot of you guys, you'll be aiming for higher than a H4, right? But I will talk through the answer to that question and the answer to all the rest of them as we go through a few more parts here. So if I click here onto this next part, you will see this. There was actually one question, I don't have it here, and I'll ask you guys, my regular students, you might answer this. It was actually, I had it in the earlier one, but it didn't appear here for some reason. The question was this: what do you do in a question when you don't know what to do? That was the question. So can any of my regular week-to-week students tell me what the answer would be? I can see it. I can see you firing the answer. Okay. So the student asked it earlier. They were saying, like, what do you do in a question when you don't know what to do? So my guys are answering here. Thank you, Cadence, and thank you, Katie. I have this phrase. Thank you, Emma. It's this: if you don't know what to do what you know. If you don't know what to do what you know. And what that means is you got to try and get started. You do what you know, you do the first line of the question, and sometimes the first line leads to the second line leads to the third line. And thank you very much. Thanks, guys. I know I didn't spot everyone going through there, but thanks. So if you don't know what to do, you do what you know. We'll see what that means in detail now in a moment. Okay, when you turn over the exam paper this year, you'll be looking at something like this. When I say something like this, you'll be looking at exactly this. These will be your instructions. You will have your section A, and there will be 6 questions from which you will be marked on your best 4, and that will get you a total of 120 marks. Okay, so there's a total, well, you'd be hoping to get 120 marks, but you can get a maximum of 120. In section B, so section A is the short questions, section B are the long questions. There are 4 questions to choose from. You must do 2, and you can gain a total of 100 marks. Let's see who is awake on this Tuesday at probably around 20 past 8. You can see, of course, that there are 220 marks in total that you can gain in the paper, right? So 220 is full marks. But let me ask you this: how many marks are there on the paper? You know, how many marks are there on the paper? So there's 220 is the maximum you can get. But how many marks are there altogether? There's 6 short questions, there are 4 long questions. Well, Michael was in there first. He was in there fast. There's a lot of people in there fast as well. And some of you are scratching your head saying, what does he mean by that? So I'm saying there are 6 short questions, each worth 30 marks. There are 4 long questions, each worth 50 marks. So you have it. The total is 380. So this is good news for you. I want you to just take this into account for a moment, right? If you went back a couple of years ago, there were 300 marks on each paper, 300 marks on each paper, and you had to do all 300. You know, there was no choice. Now there's 380, let's say, marks there on the paper, you know, 6 short questions, 4 long questions, but you only have to do 220 marks worth. So that is only around 58% of the paper is what you have to do, meaning 42% you don't have to do. And you would have to say that that is, you know, that is easier than the old way where there was no choice particularly. So even though your pre-exam could well have been very challenging, what happens now as you go towards the real exam, as you get used to the questions, as you practice more, you will find that you will, number one, your grade in the pre mightn't be as bad as you think, but number 2, you will improve as you get better and practice these questions more. The question came in, 2 questions I'm going to answer at this point, says, should you do the minimum or should you do more than the minimum? And what is your timing? Well, what I'd say is this. My general advice for paper 1 is that at a minimum, you should do 5 short questions and 2 long questions, okay? At a minimum. You will have time for that much on the day of your exam, because by that stage, you'll be fine-tuned. On the day of your Leaving Cert Maths exam, you might be as good at maths as you'll ever be in your life, because you'll be so well practiced, so well drilled at that stage. So that's what I would be saying for paper 1. Now in paper 2, I'm going to say something slightly different. It depends on the questions you're doing, but I'll come to that in a while. We'll talk about paper 1 first. Around timing, in the old course, you would say when there was no choice, when I say the old course, I mean 2 years ago, there were 300 marks and there were 150 minutes to do the exam. There's still 150 minutes, right? But that meant for every minute you should be getting 2 marks, or you could say for every mark it was half a minute. In simple terms, for a 50-mark question, you should have been spending 25 minutes. And I still think that's a pretty good rule of thumb, that if it's a 50-mark question, if you spend 25 minutes at it, if it's a 30-mark question, spend 15 minutes at it, that will get you the minimum done with time to spare, and will even allow you to do 5 and 2, as I'm describing here, with time to spare. Okay? Some people will do more than that. It's not that I think that's a terrible strategy, okay? Not at all. But I think 5 and 2 is a good strategy. Now, some people still aren't totally sure on what exactly is in paper 1 and paper 2, although you're more sure now after the exam. What you're looking at there are what we call the three strands of paper one: algebra, functions and calculus, and number. And broadly speaking, you'll see here, people ask like, which questions carry the most marks, which areas? Well, what we see here is this, that algebra, functions and calculus, and number, broadly speaking, have been worked around the same amount of marks over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Sometimes, you could argue a different way what falls into which categories sometimes, because the questions can have different parts in there. Now, I'm going to say this to you. These are your three strands. I bet you. How many people are looking at number saying, what's number exactly? Who's in that boat thinking, they're saying, I know what algebra is, I know what functions and calculus is. I see the hands are going up there, and there's some people going into chat saying me. I understand. I'm going to break that down. Because we've only got 40 minutes, I'm going to say this. In a nutshell, each one of you should prepare to do the algebra questions in the exam. Plain and simple. Why? You did it you did algebra in junior cert. You did algebra in fourth year. You did algebra in fifth year. And every time you're practicing for any exam, you're doing algebra. You're better at algebra than maybe you think you are. And what happens as you practice all of the other topics is you even get better again at algebra, because when you're practicing the circle, what are you doing? You're practicing loads of algebra skills. I'm going to say that this, in the 21-day course last year, and even in one of the weekly grinds lately, the online lessons, a student was saying the same thing, that they were saying, can they get away with calculus? And I know one of the students, I saw his name there, who was doing the HPAT there this week, he was with me on the 21-day course last year. And you might remember this, that one of the students was asking, could she get away with not doing differentiation? And I categorically said, no way. You cannot get away with it without doing differentiation, because it just comes up everywhere. And last year, paper one was littered with differentiation. It was all over it. And it comes up in paper two as well. So in the functions and calculus strand, you're going to be covering differentiation. But if you're going to do differentiation, then you have to do integration, because at the integration can come up weaved into a differentiation question, which it did last year, came up twice in two different places. And if you're doing integration and differentiation, then you got to cover functions, because functions, calculus is just an extension of functions. And again, you could have a question about differentiation, and then you might be asked about, is it an injective function or a bijective, or, what is the inverse? So you have to know, this is what I'm going to say for every one of you students here. You have to practice and prepare for algebra. You have to practice and prepare for functions and calculus. So then when it comes down to choice in paper one and what to study, really you're looking at number, okay? And let me see here. So I'm going to scroll down. I see some questions here in the Q&A, and I will come back to that. What is the 21-day challenge? The 21-day challenge was something we came up with last year, which is this. I'm going to just flick onto here now in a second. You're going to see number. And the 3 weeks before the Leaving Cert, we have a course. It was going to be half an hour a day, but it ended up at 40 minutes a day, where we covered the whole course, the key topics, over those 3 weeks. And it worked really well last year. So we'll have it again this year. This is what number is, the strand. Number breaks down into these various parts. And the size of the oval or the ball, roughly speaking, represents how many marks has been worked over the years. So number breaks down to patterns, sequences, and series. That's has been the most important. You're not going to avoid that, I would suggest. Some people don't like it and try to avoid it. Maybe fair enough, but it's a big one anyway. Some years it's came up worth an awful lot of marks. Indices and logs, again, has become a very common and popular question, linked, of course, to algebra, linked to functions. Again, I would not expect you to be planning on avoiding that. Area and volume is in the number strand, but it also comes up, so area and volume can come up with differentiation, max min, and it can come up in trigonometry and geometry. So you're not going to avoid area and volume. I know some of you are hoping you will, but don't try to avoid that. So then you're down to these four: number systems, induction, complex numbers, and financial maths. Now, here's what I'm going to say. If a student says to me, any of my guys, and I have guys, a lot of guys going for H1s and H2s this year. If they come to me in the month of May and say, I'm going to skip any of those, I'm not going to study induction or financial maths or complex numbers or number systems, any one of them, right? I'm going to say, no problem. Well, I'm going to ask them why. And if they say, I just don't like it, I'm going to say, no problem. That's great. They will get away without studying one of those. Okay? I'll have taught it to them. But if they don't like it, that's fair enough. I'm going to just do one thing here now. So just bear with me for this part, right? I'm going to show you where these topics all link up. Okay. So, because I know this might be of help to people. So in this here, so we're paper one, right? Again, if I go back through it, statistics are not statistics. I'm looking at the S. Sequence and series, is connected to algebra and functions. In my mind, I would not be advising anyone to skip that. Indices and logs, same thing. Some people would say that's part of algebra. Some people would say it's part of functions. So they're very much connected all together. Area and volume, you're going to see in a while here, is connected not only just to functions and calculus, but over here to trigonometry in a moment. Some students are not, and some teachers are not planning on teaching complex numbers. I wouldn't argue with that. It's one that the reason the teacher will say that they're going to skip it is they feel it'll come up as one short question and it won't leak into any other questions. And if they just cut it off from the start, decision made, focus on the rest of it, fair enough. However, for the H1, H2 student, I do feel the complex numbers is a fairly grand question, really. A couple of unusual parts in the last few years, I will say that. But when you're practicing complex numbers, you're practicing your algebra skills and you're also practicing your trigonometry skills. So therefore, I think it's quite a good one. I will be advising my guys to go for it, but I understand why people leave it out. Financial maths can be another one. Now, financial maths, I'm going to put it over here, even though when I put it here, right, it is connected to algebra, like you see, when you're doing financial maths questions, it's a lot of algebra skills. However, it's a kind of standalone topic. Okay, like if you don't do financial maths, it doesn't link on to something after financial maths that'll catch you. So students and teachers in the past have left out financial maths and gotten away with it. However, that said, I do feel it is going to come up this year, right? If I had to, I do feel it will come up. I do feel there's a good chance it could come up as a long question, and that if you master it, it's actually fairly straightforward because it's not that big a topic. So you can master it and be confident that you'll do well in it. So there's a double-edged sword there with that one. Okay. Number systems, you might be saying, what are number systems? Well, number systems, you could call them a few different things if you want. Number systems, if you remember those questions where they'd have like the kind of Venn diagram kind of jobs, where they'd be the overlapping ovals, really, with natural numbers, integers, real numbers, complex numbers, things like that. And also you could say arithmetic might be in there, and you're talking about stuff then like time, distance, speed, of which there was a lot of last year. Well, sometimes people would say, particularly those overlapping ovals, if you know the ones I'm talking about, sometimes students will say, I'm just steering away from that. And that's fair enough because they haven't come up very often. And sometimes students will just avoid them. I wouldn't argue with it. However, last year, like I said, time, distance, speed seemed to come up all over the place. This last one then is induction. No. Anyone here planning on not doing induction? A couple of hands up for that. What I'd say about induction is this. Induction is a topic that if there was no choice in the exam, I'd be saying to H1, H2 students, right, practice enough of this and you're going to get it. Just, once you have the logic, you practice a few different examples, you're going to get this and it's going to be fine. However, in the earlier class today, the H6, 5, 4, 3 class, I suggested to students that if they didn't like induction, so their teacher taught them induction, but they kind of didn't like it, it might be a bit too abstract for them, they will more than likely get away without it. 2 reasons. I always get students, if a student says they're going to cover everything and they're going to, no matter what, they're going to do everything. I ask them this question. So I'll take induction as the example. I say, if induction comes up, are you going to do it? And if the answer is no, well, then you'd have to say, well, why are you going to study it? Okay. And sometimes students would say, just as a backup, no problem. However, if you know you're not going to study it, if you know you're not going to do it, and if they were going for a H6543, I would be inclined not to go for induction. And the other reason is, it came up broadly speaking every 2 or 3 years, and it did come up last year, and it's been common enough for the last couple of years. In the last 3 years, I think it's came up twice. So I would be inclined to think it probably won't show up on this year's exam. That's a guess, but at the same time, it would be one that I think people could take a chance on avoiding. Okay, and I know some people haven't done it yet. Okay. We're going to be finished with paper 1 there. I'm going to move on to paper 2, and I'm going to talk about something slightly, and I'm going to talk about a slightly different approach in paper 2. Okay. Now, I see some more questions there in the Q&A, but I think I can get back to all of those at the end. Okay. So let me click back in here, and here we are. We're on to paper 2. Paper 2. Well, I would suggest that most people here have studied more and are more comfortable with paper 1 at this moment than paper 2. So I'll ask you the question, which one are you more comfortable with, paper 1 or paper 2? Which have you done more of, we'll say, that, which one are you better at? Am I right or am I wrong? So I'm just watching them coming through here. So it's somewhere like, maybe 60% paper 1. No, maybe it's a bit more than that. Maybe it's like 2/3 paper 1 and 1/3 paper 2. And someone put in the comment, paper 1 is so much easier, in my opinion. Okay. And I think that's around what people would typically find at this time of the year. And there's a reason why. Most times people start with algebra in 5th year. And so therefore, that's a big chunk of it already, and that leads into some of the other topics. The other part in paper 2 is that these 2 strands, geometry and trigonometry being one strand and statistics and probability, are very different from each other. They're very different strands. So they don't overlap in the way that the other ones do. I will point out this. I hope you see here that the geometry and trigonometry circle is bigger than the stats and probability one. That's indicating that over the years, over the last, say, 10 years, geometry and trigonometry has been worth more than stats and probability. However, having said that, I always draw attention to the importance of statistics and probability. In fact, I would go as far as to say this. For a lot of students, statistics and probability, or one part thereof, will be their best topic. And it's always, you have to teach something last, but a lot of times teachers leave stats and probability to last. And some is slightly unfortunate because the student might have this topic that they're great at, but they don't find out till right till the end. Now, it can be the opposite way, particularly with probability. Some people just kind of are a bit allergic to probability. They don't like it. But again, they don't find that out till the end. Now, I'm going to break down each one of these, break them down into the parts, and talk about potentially what one could maybe steer away from or steer towards. But I will just give my general strategy here for paper 2. It depends on which questions you do. If you do lots of geometry and trigonometry, I would be still inclined to have 5 short questions with 2 long questions. If you do a lot of statistics and probability, the reality is they're just faster questions, particularly probability ones. Like the answer sometimes can be like, a quarter times a quarter is 1/16. That's all the workings. Okay. So they are just quicker. So because of that, I think if you do a lot of statistics and probability questions, I suggest that you do one extra one in the short and the long. So 5 short questions, 3 long questions. But over the weeks and, at the Easter revision course and things like that, I will talk about all of that in more detail because it always has to be fleshed out a bit. I know that's I'm giving the broad overview there. Okay, let's have a look at geometry and trigonometry. Just to say just how it all links together. Geometry and trigonometry, of course, there's a big connection with functions. And sometimes people think it's very mean that trigonometry comes up in paper 1 and paper 2. The trigonometric functions can come up in either. Why? Because trigonometry is paper 2, but functions is paper 1. So trigonometric functions comes up in either. And again, when you're doing trigonometry and geometry, what are you practicing? You're practicing algebra. How do you solve a trigonometric equation? You isolate the variable, same as you do in an algebraic equation. Now, when we look at this, here are the various parts of trigonometry, geometry strand. Now, in a nutshell, and these are just broad strokes, but you can see that trigonometry is the dominant part of this strand. And again, I say to those of you who think, I hate trigonometry, I'm going to try and avoid that. You'll just have to get over that. And you're just going to have to do trigonometry because there's no avoiding it. There was 2 places that came up in paper 1 last year, trigonometry. So, and it was, just all over the place there in paper 2 as well. So trigonometry is vital. There's only one thing to do, and that's to master it. I think if I'm right, the first lessons in the next block of the weekly grinds are trigonometry. And after that, then the line and circle are ones that students typically do. They often come up as short questions in paper 2. There's a slight, I have a slight feeling there could be a long question in coordinate geometry as well this year. But again, we can come back to that another time. So after that, then, so I would think, if you have trigonometry, if you've committed the time to doing that well, and if you're good enough with the line and the circle, you're down to these 4 smaller parts then to see, can you leave anything out? What can you focus on? Now, let me ask you this question. When you fill in the survey, a lot of students said that they were going to leave out constructions. A good few students said that. Anyone tell me why? Why would you leave out constructions? I was a bit surprised that there were that many people saying they were going to leave it out. So anyone give me a bit of insight into that? A joke has come in. Geometry is where I draw the line. So no one's putting in any answer for why they're not going to do constructions. But there was I think there's some comments come in there. There was a good few people said that they weren't going to do it. Now, let me just draw attention here to these little ovals. Theorems, you know what the theorems are, I would suggest you. At least you kind of know what they are. They're there, theorem 11, 12, and 13, okay? That you have to learn them off. Now, I'm going to talk about those in a moment. What the cuts are those diagrams, geometrical diagrams, where you got to figure out angles, you got to use the theorems to figure out something. So, those have come up in various years. I'm going to show you something about the marks for those now in a minute. Transformations are actually, they haven't come up worth quite as much. The reason I had to have the oval that big was because it's a long word, but even stuff like enlargements in there, things like that, they haven't been that important. Constructions, let me just see what the answer is. Yeah, okay, so there's a lot of constructions to learn. Now, I think that's part of the thing. I want to leave it out because, sorry, I'm just reading that one again. Because I get confused in them and always get them wrong. Well, that's fair enough, okay? I'm going to do it. Okay, so the counter argument here, I'm going to do it because, okay, I'm going to do it. Sorry, I'm just going to read this again. Because teachers just never do it at schools with students. Well, okay, that's his guess. Yeah, that's the guess of why it is. Well, what I would say is this, my compass doesn't work. What I will say this, what you got to do is this. You have to make sure if you're doing constructions that you have a mathematical set on the day that you're very comfortable with and confident with. That's it. That's the answer to the question from Jack. Thank you, Jack. There's only really 4 constructions really that you have to focus on. The orthocenter, the incenter, the centroid, and the circumcenter and the circumcircle. Okay. And here's another one. If you did JC Tech graphics, you're sorted. And that is true. I'm going to say 2 things. For those of you who said you're going to focus on theorems but not constructions, I'm going to suggest you think that the other way around. Okay. If we look at theorems, these are the theorems that have come up. Theorem 11 has come up in 2010, 11, 12, and 2015. Okay. I think that the reason it came up 3 times in a row, I think that was to do with sample papers. But I know there's some maths teachers here today. If anyone can remind me, just it's a bit unusual why it came up in 10, 11, and 12. I think it was to do with sample papers. Theorem 12 came up in 2018. Theorem 13 came up in 2014 and 21. Now, last year, this was one of my major tips for the exam, was that Theorem 13 would be the trigonometric or the geometrical theorem that came up that year. And sure enough, it was. A lot of people felt that Theorem 11 would come up again, maybe perhaps because it was so common in those early years. What I'm going to suggest is if you look at this, so in 2015, there was a theorem, but there was none in 16 and 17. It came up in 2018. There was no theorem in 19 and 20. There was in 2021. If you don't like the theorems and if you don't like geometry, I think it's one that you could take a chance on and leave it out. And if you ask yourself this question, will you do it if it comes up? If the answer is no, then I think you will be worthwhile focusing elsewhere. However, I'm going to go along with the comment about constructions. There's only really 4 to master. And I know I have a half-hour recorded lesson on them that I give to all the students. And, you know, all you got to do is practice that over and over and you're going to have it. So, yes, I was thinking the great Horst Punzet is here. And 2010 and 11 were for the pilot schools only. Thank you, Horst. And I had a feeling he might know the answer to that question. So I won't go down that detour, but it wasn't quite as common as you would think. 2010, 11, 12, you know, why did it come up 3 years in a row? There was a reason for it. So that's what I'm going to say. Constructions have not been as common over the last number of years as the theorems have. I think a construction is certainly due to come up. And what I would say is sometimes it gets built in to the coordinate geometry parts, okay, of the line and the circle. And I would say if you're planning on doing the line and the circle, make sure you know your constructions, okay? Now, so yes, some of my students are asking, are we going to do the theorems here? And have I got stuff for them? I do, and I actually have them all pre-recorded as well, and I will of course give those all to you. Okay, so if we look here at the trigonometry geometry strand, you can see again trigonometry is the big one. You'll notice here that I left area and volume hanging around here beside the number 1. That's to show again that if you are doing geometry and trigonometry, if you're planning on doing that, you have to know your area and volume, because it ties in. You know, it's likely in your pre-exam paper 2, there was probably an area and volume question that wouldn't be giving anything away, because they're there all the time. They're built into the trigonometry question, the geometry questions. You know, they're just very, very common. So make sure you know your area and volume. Now, the question says, which theorem would I recommend to study? Well, what I would say is this. I suppose it's a bit more open this year. But a lot of people felt Theorem 11 was going to come up last year. So, you know, I suppose if you're just to do one, maybe that'll be the one. But last year I was very confident on 13. And thankfully that worked out right. So last but not least, let me check the time. Okay. So statistics and probability. I think this is kind of the secret weapon. You know, a lot of students don't really know what it is yet. Statistics and probability can be broken into 4 parts. Now, I know some people don't like the name of this when I call it common sense probability of the permutations, combinations, you know, what am I going to call them? Bernoulli trials, stuff like that. I know people sometimes say they're not common sense, but what I mean is they kind of have like, you know, a common sense use, like, you know, if, you know, how many ways can 8 people sit down along a bench, you know, that kind of thing. So how many different permutations are there for the lottery, things like that, or combinations, I should say, for the lottery. So that's one part. The other part of probability is things like the z-scores. And the z-scores part of probability reaches over into statistics because it's used in this part here, which is inferential statistics. So statistics can be broken into 2 parts. Statistics 1, you could talk about data and charts. You know, you're calculating mean, mode, median. You know, you're drawing your scatter graph, your line of best fit, your correlation coefficient, all those kind of things, your standard deviation. Inferential statistics, what is that I hear you say? It is your confidence interval. It is your hypothesis test. It is your p-values. It is your test statistic. Now, if anyone is thinking of heading away, don't head away yet. Write this down. Inferential statistics is one that you should absolutely focus on and master before the exam. Why? One, you can, right? It's one that often seems difficult as you go through it, but when you revise it, it's not half as bad. And second, and I'm going to say more importantly, I think it's very likely to come up worth the full 50 marks of a long question this year, you know, a really significant part. Why? Because last year's exam, there was only 1 statistics question. It was inferential statistics, but it wasn't even a full long question. Like, I think around 20 marks of that long question were probability. So last year, probability was worth more than statistics. And this year, I reckon that'll be reversed because statistics is a very big topic, you know, and it's one that almost all students will come across in college. So it was surprising, really, there was so little statistics last year. So therefore, I would say to you that that is one that you could certainly spend time on and make sure that you're confident in that going into the exam. The probability parts, some people love them and some people hate them, you know. So it's a matter of chance, maybe which one you will be if you haven't done it yet. Now, on that, right, we're kind of at the end of it, right? I hope you're taking something from it. I hope you're going to take the key message that it's this, that if you work hard between now and June, it will come together for you. And as you're revising trigonometry, you'll be improving your algebra. Even as you're revising statistics, inferential statistics, confidence intervals, what are they? Inequalities, you know? So you're revising stuff, you know, you're revising the other topics, you know, as you learn the later parts. I see there's questions coming in here in the Q&A. I'm going to go through all of those now. If anyone is signing off, I hope to see you again, right? And you know, we have the weekly lessons, 8 o'clock on Tuesday nights for the H1, H2 students.